I was somebody who never really grew up with the Ratchet & Clank games, having only played at a PS3 Future Trilogy and Size Matters. It wasn't until I became a young adult that I got to play the PS2 classics after getting my hands on the PS3 HD collection. However, there was one game that was missing, and that was none other than the black sheep of the franchise, Ratchet Deadlocked. To describe it, Deadlocked is like that one elusive man that you hear so much about, but you never get a chance to meet him. I was aware that there were quite a few varying opinions on Deadlocked, considering that it was a one-time experiment of something new for the series. However, if I were to be completely honest, I don't think it strays too far from the series' roots. In fact, compared to other big changes I've seen some more major franchises go through, the new things Deadlocked introduced don't feel significant enough to pull the franchise into a completely foreign direction. It's very interesting that I say this, because Insomniac had the exact opposite in mind when developing this game. Moving on to the fourth installment was always going to be a challenge, because at this point the formula had the potential of getting stale, so they felt it necessary to change it up somehow. There were at least two different ideas that were thrown around. One of them was a project called Ratchet & Clank Nexus, which focuses on the duo being only at one planet while they have disagreements on how to handle the war occurring there. Interestingly, the title would later be integrated as a future installment known as Into the Nexus, but the original concept was altogether scrapped. The other idea they had cooking was a Twisted Metal-style racing game. Unfortunately, Jack X was already in development by Naughty Dog at the same time, so that too never made it past the drawing board. Finally, they looked to the Halo franchise and decided to borrow multiple elements as inspiration to make Ratchet Deadlocked. Reviews across the board were generally very positive, although the scores were noticeably a lot lower. This was mostly because the critics didn't respond very well to the changes this game tried to make, but as I'm about to expound upon, Deadlocked is actually a step forward for the series rather than a step back. I'd argue that Deadlocked fixed a lot of the problems that Up Your Arsenal suffered from. It's not the best Ratchet & Clank game, but it's an improvement of what came before, and considering all the praise that game gets, that's saying a lot. So one thing that a lot of people note is the darker tone Deadlocked contains, and yes, this game takes itself more seriously compared to the others. Unlike the previous Ratchet & Clanks, Deadlocked doesn't begin with us seeing our titular hero hanging out. It instead starts with somebody's death. That's right, Ace Hardlight murders Captain Starshield live on TV to boost the ratings of the Gladiator-themed TV show Dread Zone. This gives a glimpse into what Deadlocked is going to be about, and how this isn't going to be your typical world-saving quest like the first three games. It's only after that event do we finally see the main protagonists of Ratchet, Clank, and Al. They're busy taking care of the Starship Phoenix when all of a sudden they're ambushed and taken to the arena of the aforementioned TV show. We're further detailed that it's run by Gleeman Vox and mostly involves captured heroes clashing against one another. I really like how the game tries to show the weakened state Ratchet is in. First of all, he and his friends are outfitted with collars that either electrocute them or detonate if they ever dare to become rebellious. Ratchet himself is also inside of a suit of armor that stiffens his movement. Also, whereas in the previous Ratchet & Clanks he was fighting to save the galaxy, in Deadlocked he's fighting to fend for himself. He's a pawn of the system, a cog in the machine. Basically, it's commentary on celebrity culture. Even though it looks like he's moving up the rankings as he fights more battles, Ratchet doesn't have any personal freedoms. He's at the mercy of Gleeman Vox himself. Let me tell you, if you thought that Dr. Nefarious was a bad villain, then Vox really is a more pleasant change. In many ways, he reminds me of Chairman Drek, somebody who's so diabolically capitalist that you love to hate him. Even though Ratchet has very little interaction with him, he still presents a threat in the sense that you always feel like he's watching you, waiting for you to fail or fuck up. It's made clear in the beginning that you're dispensable to him, merely an object to bring up the ratings. So to finally face him and kill him feels satisfying in the sense that you're finally freed from his grasp. The secondary villain, Ace Hardlight, also carries more depth than Up Your Arsenal's Clunk. One thing notable about him is his short but impactful heel-face turn. Some people might find his change of heart to be really problematic because it happens out of nowhere. Up to this point, he seems to be living the life when it came to killing heroes, and all it takes is Ratchet to give him a beating for him to change his mind about it. However, I could argue that maybe Ace always felt this way. Deep down, he felt unsatisfied with the constant killing. I mean, just look at the part where he attacks Al. According to Clank, he didn't act on his own initiative. He did it on behalf of Gleeman Vox, which demonstrates the control he has over him. It actually gives Hardlight some form of vulnerability. When his action figures aren't selling and the fans start to prefer Ratchet over him, he feels the need to defeat him, which ultimately represents the work grind that big corporations force onto people. There's one scene where Vox gets pissed at him for failing to reach the required sales of his merchandise, and it really describes just how much of a pawn Ace is under Vox's thumb. So, when Ratchet finally puts him out of his misery, even though Ace Hardlight is freed from the bondage Dreadzone shackled him with, he also feels the weight of having missed out on so much of his life. While not much of his past is known, it's implied that Dreadzone has imprisoned him for a good chunk of his livelihood. It's similar to what Transformers 1 did with D16. D16 didn't know a life outside of his work, and he'd been led to believe that he was doing the right thing by mining for Energon. However, when it's discovered that Sentinel Prime was a selfish dick with his own interests in mind, he starts to question why he's even doing this. While Ace Hardlight doesn't have the same sense of rebellion as D16, he is a slave to the system just as much as Megatron was, and his final warning to Ratchet shows how he lived a double life. While the media tried to portray him as somebody who was strong and noble, in reality, the celebrity life was killing him. That's actually quite a bit of depth when it comes to the villains. I can't say the same for the heroes. Ratchet and Clank sort of show a little bit of disagreement when it comes to the nature of their captivity. Ratchet initially really likes being a star and seems enthusiastic about it, whereas Clank is concerned about the path they're headed. But this division doesn't last very long. As soon as Ratchet sees how the media is manipulating the audience's perception of him, he snaps out of it. What Insomniac should have done to make the conflict seem more developed would be to have Ratchet fully embrace the fame and glory he was getting in Dreadzone. Clank would constantly try to warn him, but Ratchet would be too self-absorbed in the newfound praise Vox Entertainment was heaping on him. Like, it needs to be fleshed out more. Ratchet simply watching one news report and coming to his senses doesn't make the conflict terribly interesting. The announcers of Dallas and Juanita are both really funny. The commentary adds a lot of personality to the stages as you fight. The fact they're always doubting you makes you feel just as determined as Ratchet to prove them wrong. It's also a lot of fun when they change their tone about you towards the end of the game when they're no longer under Vox's control.
I'm gonna break character for just a second and say, watch out! If you don't, we all die!
It shows how most of their commentary was an act, and it didn't reflect on what they truly thought, which isn't too different from the real-life media. Unfortunately, they didn't go all the way with this darker tone. There's a scene where Al supposedly dies at the hands of Ace Hardlight. Seriously, what a cowardly thing to do, Ace. When I get my fucking hands on you... Oh wait, he's alive. What the hell? When they did something similar in A Crack in Time, it was devastating to see Ratchet get killed. I was like, holy shit, they actually went there. And they even have a good explanation as to how Ratchet is able to come back, which is through Clank rewinding time. But here it feels so all of a sudden. Like, they brought him back with robot arms. Seriously, Insomniac. Al literally got shot at point blank. Robot limbs shouldn't be enough to completely heal him. I'm sure most of you are probably wondering why I've said so little about the two combat bots, Merc and Green. Well, it's because the game barely does anything with them. We just know that they used to be aligned with a former contestant that ended up dying. For the most part, they don't really impact the story in a meaningful way. They're just sidekicks that help Ratchet in the journey and replace Clank. But despite those criticisms, Deadlocked has a very strong story. Some might say the darker tone makes it different, but considering it maintains the consumerist culture themes, it's really more of the same, but more epic. This is better than Up Your Arsenal, because that game seemingly abandoned those themes for a bunch of jokes. But this isn't the only area where Deadlocked was an improvement. The gameplay is probably the most polished it has ever been. You might wonder, how does a game with only 10 weapons and a style that's not the same be better? Well, first of all, it cuts the fat while staying true to the core gameplay of the series. While Up Your Arsenal had a lot of branching paths, it felt watered down compared to what was done in the predecessors because the alternate roads usually didn't lead to anywhere interesting. I mean, finding the Bolt Scrabber in Zeldrin wasn't nearly as exciting as meeting the plumber. There's this sense of exploration when finding a different character. So Deadlocked fixed all of this by removing this aspect altogether, creating a more focused experience. All the platforming and exploration are all kept to a minimum. Its entire identity surrounds blowing shit up, and despite its limited arsenal, it still manages to make this fun as hell. Insomniac made up for the 10-gun limit with the introduction of Alpha and Omega mods. Omega mods change up the nature of the weapon. These include freezing your enemies, creating napalm around them, and poisoning them. As a side note, I'd strongly recommend playing on the higher difficulties because it forces you to play the way that it's intended. Since enemies will be hitting harder, certain mods are better than others in some situations. The freeze mod on the dual Vipers is really good at slowing the mobility of the big staff-wielding soldiers that fire lasers. I usually put the timed bomb mod on the B6 Obliterator because it makes their explosion go from being a whimper to a massive nuke that covers quite an area. Ultimately, the mods make the starting weapons more useful even in the late game, which was an issue in the previous entries. Deadlock's weapons also carry more realism compared to before. There are subtle things like how the magma cannon and dual Vipers shoot bullets to make them feel like actual guns. The game has taken older weapons and given them a level of badass. The Scorpion Flail is loosely based off of the Plasma Whip. However, instead of just using the regular wrench swinging animation, Ratchet will slam the flail into the ground to obliterate his foes. There's a caveat to this, and that's the fact you have to stand still while using it, which makes you open to enemy fire. Therefore, I recommend using the shock mod while wielding it because it takes out multiple surrounding enemies, making it less likely for you to take a hit while using it. On the other hand, there are the Seeker Mines, which are bigger and badder versions of a similar weapon from the first game. With their impactful explosions and homing sound effects, it was addicting to just spam these. Maybe this makes it a bit overpowered, but it was still fun to use, and that's all that matters, right? Of course, you have returning weapons like the Arbiter, which is like your rocket launcher, and the mini turret gun, which is a typical balloon tower defense machine gun that locks onto enemies in their proximity, and those all work just as well as they had previously. Sometimes the mods make their usage feel different, like it was always fun to turn my enemies into ducks or pigs with my Arbiter with the Morph mod, but for the most part, they function the same. As for the Alpha mods, they mostly focus on ammunition upgrades, increasing area effect, and more practical aspects that have less to do with style. Speaking of which, now you can level up your weapons beyond a level 5 in a non-challenge mode playthrough, which adds to the incentive of using your entire arsenal. Sadly, while the combat has some variety, the enemy types are repetitive. You know the baboons from The Legend of Spyro? They were all just reskins of one another. The same could be said for the enemies in Deadlocked. Granted, they do introduce different types, like you've got the snipers, the big robot soldiers, the dropships, but it's limited to those, and they don't really change them up all that much. I mean, in the end game, you get to fight invisible versions of the same enemy, but that doesn't add any new characteristics to how they're fought. To a lesser degree, the same could be said of the arena challenges Dreadzone pits Ratchet in. They usually involve him turning a certain amount of bolt cranks, hacking a certain amount of nodes, and destroying certain structures. They generally don't do much to change the game. The different vehicles, though, do provide a break from the core gameplay of running and gunning. The Landstalker might be slow, but the missiles are really satisfying to use since you can shoot several enemies at once. The speeder bike handles well and feels fast to control, which makes a lot of the missions very exciting with how they're presented. The dual analog controls felt somewhat loose, especially when flying through the rings, and this was especially noticeable with the hover ship. It's simply not designed to do these ring challenges, since you have to navigate the X and Y axis in an open field. Add to the fact that precision plays a part in these challenges, and it all creates a huge pain in the ass. In fact, this might be one of the few areas where Up Your Arsenal was better, because you didn't have to deal with these asinine controls. You also get to control this jeep known as the Puma, which is inspired by a similar vehicle from Halo.
Looks like a Like a big cat of some kind.
What, like a puma?
Yeah, man, there you go.
Generally, the handling felt versatile to control, and it was nice being able to get in and out of the vehicle instead of being permanently confined to it, which gave more flexibility in how you completed the missions. One of the biggest differences in this game is the absence of Clank. He's now relegated to the guy that keys Ratchet in on hints and tips secretly without Vox knowing. As stated before, he now has Merc and Green to assist him. In one sense, they're better than Clank because they have a variety of functions. They can provide grind rails for Ratchet to ride, turn bolt cranks, and provide backup during combat. It kind of reminds me of the party members from Kingdom Hearts, and it adds a certain level of intensity to the battles as you constantly need to be communicating with them while shooting your way through waves of enemies. Al's workshop also provides them with different paint jobs and upgrades to make them more useful in combat. Still, as solid of a job Insomniac did at designing them, I miss my glide and long jump. Sure, the platforming isn't as involved in this game, but there were times when I was holding the X button and wondering why my glide wasn't coming out. Moving on to the music, the style has somewhat changed, although there is still some resemblance of the old Ratchet & Clank soundtrack. Take the Dreadzone station as an example. You can hear the synthesized music with the techy, electronic textures accompanying it, which is what's typically expected for Ratchet & Clank. On the other hand, a lot of the other songs use dramatic tritones, which is used to convey fear. The opening to the Ghost Station makes a lot of use of this to create this feeling of mystery. The Ghost Station is known to be unfinished and unbeatable, so the music reflects walking into the unknown. During the battle against Ace Hardlight, there are a lot of short vocal samples in the beginning. It sounds like somebody is breathing really hard, which kind of articulates the toughness of Ace. Also in the fight, he is constantly trying to ignore pain, so this could also represent how hard he's pushing himself. And who could forget the Victory soundtrack? With its use of the electric guitar, it really feels like a celebration of your win. Fun fact, I used this music for my theme song in the early days of my channel. Ah, how I feel nostalgic for those days. Overall, the music takes a chance to make something that feels new, even though it's not too different. And that's the game in a nutshell. Deadlocked is changed done right. The story may have been darker in tone, but they still maintained themes criticizing consumerist society and celebrity culture. Exploration may have been kept to a minimum, but they took advantage of that by creating a more focused gameplay experience. Overall, it's certainly a step up from Up Your Arsenal, and I know I'm in the minority here. Basically, it's an innovation that remembered to stick to its roots. It changed Ratchet & Clank just enough to create something new while not alienating the general audience. In fact, this is the last good Ratchet & Clank game because size matters, secret sack of shit, and a future trilogy butchered this series. So, I guess this is my final farewell to the good Ratchet games while I move on to the smelly anus butter that is what came after. Ahem. So you're saying all of them were crap? Well, okay, maybe that's an exaggeration. Plus, there's a crack in time and an Infinite Nexus to look forward to. This has gone on long enough. I'll catch you guys later.